For Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we go from lack of consultation and accommodation with regards to resource development to lack of consultation and accommodation with regards to the First Nations Education Act. Yeah. And I asked the Minister whether or not he would look at closing the funding gap, and in the Minister's response, he said that they would pay the cost of education at the secondary and elementary levels for First Nations, but it was lacking in any kind of true commitment and detail. I want to turn for a moment to a letter written on June the 13th, 2011 from the then Provincial Minister of Education in British Columbia to the then Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And there's a couple of points in here that are important. One is that he's talking about, the Minister is talking about a number of agreements that take place between BC First Nations and the province of British Columbia. And he says that the form of agreement between the province and an interested First Nation is significant. It is not a typical agreement as between the province and a service provider. It is a government-to-government agreement. Much of the language that typically is in a service agreement is not in this agreement. In this respect, it is unique and recognizes that the TCA 2005 commitment to strengthen the relationship on a government-to-government basis. In the closing of the letter, it says, while the province and First Nations often go forward on parallel agendas, the province does not provide oversight of First Nations education on First Nations lands, nor over the various initiatives of the FNSA or FNESC. This respects the integrity of the commitment of establishing a new relationship based on mutual recognition, respect and recognition. And Mr. Speaker, those 2 points are important when we come to talk about funding. I also want to mention the report, Nurturing the Learning Spirit of First Nations Students. And in that report, it clearly outlined that statutory funding that is needs-based, predictable, sustainable, and used specifically for education purposes. Now, the Minister led any listeners and this House to believe that somehow what's in the draft proposal meets that requirement, and in fact it does not. I want to turn to something that comes from Australia, and it says it's a document that talks about what ministerial obligations are. And in the introduction it says how to determine whether a legislative provision imposes an obligation or confers a discretion. And they go on to talk about a particular section, Section 33. It says, in any act or instrument, the word may, if used to confer a power, indicates that the power may be exercised or not at discretion. And Part 2, in any act or instrument, the word shall, if used to impose a duty, indicates that the duty must be performed. And so, Mr. Speaker, when I look at the proposal that the government has put forward, of course, in the Section 31.1 on funding, in the notes, it says this provision established that the Minister may fund a First Nation or a First Nation Education Authority to operate one or more schools. So, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the proposed legislation does not require this government to come up with equitable funding, comparable funding to what provinces provide for their students. So when will this government provide that equitable funding?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from the Honourable Member from Nanaimo-Cowichan. I also appreciate the Member from Nipissing-Temiskaming supporting me in giving my answer here tonight. I'd like to remind the Honourable Member from the Opposition that our government firmly believes that all First Nation students across Canada deserve access to a school system that meets provincial and territorial standards while respecting First Nation culture, language, rights, and treaties. It is not just our government that has been calling for change. First Nations have been advocating for greater control over their children's education for decades. This is something that has been reiterated to the Minister on numerous occasions by First Nations across the country pressing for education reform. Our government is listening to these calls from First Nations leadership, educators, technicians, and youth who are unhappy with the current non-system that has been failing First Nations students for years. It is time to provide First Nations with choice in terms of the management and delivery of education in their communities. It's time to work with them to ensure that First Nations students get the education system they deserve. In short, it is time for reform of the First Nations education system. Over the past year, our government has contributed over $1.5 billion to support First Nation elementary and secondary education. On a per capita basis, this amounts to approximately $14,000 per full-time equivalent student. Not included in this calculation is an investment of approximately $200 million to maintain and improve education infrastructure for band-operated schools. Despite these investments, it is clear that money is not the only solution. The non-system of education is not working for the majority of First Nation students who do not graduate from high school. This is the sad reality and undeniable truth. Many with direct experience in First Nations education, as well as the Auditor General of Canada, have said that this is due to a patchwork system that does not have the supports and services which are available to most Canadians. Our government committed to addressing the situation and is building on the successful models that already exist. That's why we have shared Working Together for First Nations Students, a proposal for a bill on First Nations education with every First Nation in the country, and have asked them to share a copy with their membership, along with provinces and key stakeholders, as part of the ongoing consultation process. We look forward to receiving everyone's feedback and input. This draft legislative proposal would support the vision of First Nations control of First Nations education and would create comprehensive framework to enable First Nations to design and implement their own education systems while meeting or exceeding minimum standards. In addition, the proposal would ensure education standards are of equivalent quality to school systems off reserve and would deliver a curriculum that is reflective of First Nations' unique needs, culture, and interests. This would help First Nation students achieve a quality education that allows them to move seamlessly between First Nation and provincial schools and pursue their studies in a consistent manner. It would be up to First Nations to decide how best to meet or even exceed these standards within their education programs. Mr. Speaker, this draft legislative proposal is a significant step forward in the spirit of reconciliation in pursuing our shared goal with First Nations of closing the gaps between First Nations and all Canadians. We continue to invite all First Nations to provide input on the important issue of improving education outcomes and the proposed way forward.
The honourable member for Nanaimo-Cowichan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, First Nations schools on reserve can only dream of having $14,000 per student for direct delivery of education. In a recent CBC interview, they indicated that the federal government spends well over $1 billion annually educating Aboriginal children, although much of that money goes to provincial governments, since most of the kids go to provincial schools. What happens is First Nations on reserve, when their kids go to provincial school, have to pay the provincial school rates, which leaves even less for the First Nation students on reserve. I come back to my original question, Mr. Speaker. In the section on regulations, which is where the minister says that funding will be defined, it says the minister may make any regulations. So there's a huge amount of discretion for what the minister will do with regards to funding, and nowhere in the draft regulations or in this draft document does it talk about equitable, comparable funding to provincial schools. When will this government provide equitable, comparable funding to provincial schools for First Nations on reserve? When?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, this government is committed to reforming the First Nations Education Act, and not simply addressing it with more money. We have to have reform of the system, of the non-system, as the minister has called it, before addressing the funding issue. Mr. Speaker, our government remains committed to the principle of First Nation control of First Nation education. We will continue to consult with First Nations to ensure that First Nation students have the same opportunity to succeed in their education as all Canadians, and to implement the principle of First Nation control over First Nation education. We're continuing to consult with First Nations to improve on reserve education. Ultimately, all input will contribute to improved education on reserve that guarantees base standards, provides the mechanism required for stable, predictable, and sustainable funding, and improves First Nation control over First Nation education. Mr. Speaker, we all need to work together to provide the quality education which will open up opportunities for First Nation youth, thereby preparing them for major life choices around post-secondary education, securing good jobs, and being self-sufficient and engaged citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.